Okay, in this video, we want to begin kind of talking about some of the historical things that really influenced Huxley to create Brave New World and how that is developed in the literary elements and some of the more structural ideas that we see within the Brave New World text. So that's really what this video is going to focus on, and that's what it's going to look at mostly. This will be a part one video. There will be a part two later, mostly because the part two stuff is going to come a little bit later in some of the readings, and so I want to save some of that. Now, there will be a few spoilers in here, so uh, you know, I tried to not do too much, but there will be times where we need to talk a little bit about the future of the book past where you've read. But at the same time, uh, this shouldn't take away from the enjoyment of your reading at all. So the first thing that we want to talk about a little bit about Huxley. We talked a bit about Huxley in the last video, his background, but kind of in the literary sense, first of all, Huxley received a really incredible education. He comes from a very educated family, and we talked about the nature of how he actually could begin writing about science and how he could sort of develop that sort of knowledge of science to where it's at least viable what he creates within a Brave New World in the literary text. So he received a great education, first at home and then at Eton, and that provided him with access to just so many different types of knowledge. Now, because of his near blindedness, um, he depended heavily on his first wife, Maria, to take care of him. Now, his blindness and vision are going to be motifs that are in a lot of his writing, not just Brave New World, but a lot of his writing. In fact, much of his work deals with the conflict between the interests of the individual and society, which often focuses on self realization. And so you're going to see a lot of the sort of sense of blindness and ignorance towards the self and then towards society as itself and what it means to take on social responsibility. Now, Brave New World marked a step in a sort of a new direction for Huxley. It combined both his skill for satire with his fascination of science to create a sort of dystopian or anti utopian world in which a totalitarian government controlled society by the use of science and technology and its exploration of the pitfalls of linking science, technology, and politics as sort of reduces human individuality. And that's sort of the basic argument that Huxley has. So I want to begin by kind of talking about what exactly is the background of utopia, dystopian, and also sort of really what Huxley does is more anti-utopian, not so much a dystopian. So Brave New World belongs to the genre of utopian literature. Utopia is, of course, the imaginary society that's organized to create an ideal condition for human beings to live in. It eliminates hatred, pain, neglect, and just basically the evils of the world. So the word utopia comes from Thomas More's novel Utopia from 1516, and it's derived from Greek roots that can be translated to either mean the good place or actually no place, really depending on the translation. So sometimes the society is described or meant to represent the perfect society, but sometimes utopias are actually created to satirize existing societies that are already in place and contemporary, and perhaps even to simply speculate about what life might be like under different conditions. If you look at the Amazon Prime, The Man in the High Castle show, where it talks about, well, what would have happened if you had the German forces had won World War II, or the Axis forces. So in the 1920s, just before Brave New World was written, we need to remember that a number of really satirical novels were written to describe the horrors of sort of a planned totalitarian society. Much of this, of course, was in response to World War One. The societies that they describe are called dystopias, places where things are badly, awry and awkward and different and wrong. Either term, utopia or dystopia, could really be correctly used to describe Brave New World. That's why a lot of people actually call it anti-utopian. It's sort of against the idea of utopia. The tradition of utopianism is one of the oldest forms of political and ideological writings. So since Thomas More wrote it in 1516, it actually goes back and is even traced into Plato's Republic, where he's really talking about what the best society could do. And Plato's Republic is considered to be, one of his greatest works, but lots of parts of it have been, shown to be how weak it is as far as the foundation of his ideas, as far as what a society should look like. But we can trace roots to this sort of idea of what society should look like to Plato's Republic, and also through writings like by Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Henry Thoreau, and H.G. Wells. However, in the 20th century, mostly because of World War I, and then of course World War II later on as well, I think you're going to see a sort of a real particular attention paid to what is going to happen if we do not keep ourselves in check here, especially with industrialization, modern technology, and science developing as rapidly as it did late 19th century and early 20th century. So that's why we see this real distinct dystopian writing genre sort of boom, and it continues even now. Um, the message in A Brave New World is that not only are the methods by which ends are achieved ultimately inhuman, but that all utopian ideals will simply come at a number of costs: the restriction of human liberty, the controlling of the arts, science and religion, and ultimately access to the truth, being the greatest thing for Huxley. So these are questions, and I don't think that Huxley is prescribing answers throughout Brave New World. I mean, he definitely has his ideas, but he's not describing or prescribing particular answers. He's trying to help readers think, help modern people think through different decisions that we make as far as technology, government, politics, the like. So, dystopian focus, or sort of the anti-utopian side, he's very concerned with the use of technology to control society. Um, the rigid control of reproduction through technological and medical intervention. You see this from the surgical removal of ovaries, the Bokanovsky process, and even the hypnopedic conditioning. We also see this in Brave New World through the creation of complicated entertainment machines that generate harmless leisure, and then high levels of consumption and production that are the basis of the sort of the world state stability. This, of course, is a huge indictment on American culture, as is I forget her name, the lady, the author who wrote The Hunger Games, and that, of course, being a huge indictment on American society too. It's sort of the nature of how the entire basis of the stability of America is on consumption and production. Soma is, of course, a third example of this sort of medical, biological, and psychological technology that Brave New World is going to criticize. There's a real distinction between science and technology. So the bettering of technology does not necessarily increase scientific exploration and experimentation. The state actually uses science as a means to build technology that creates sort of a seamless, superficial world. The state's focus also on happiness and stability means it uses the results of scientific research more to contribute to technologies of control, but it does not actually support the science itself. So these are going to be uh, a real indictment on the idea of being able to use technology, but not using it to forward or develop, things that are equipping our world or making the world better, but simply to contribute to making us feel better. Uh, this would be, things like using a type of plastic that might help us with climate change, but then really just having it for packaging and actually being detrimental to climate change. So something like that for that sort of example. Also, we're dealing with the incompatibility of happiness and truth. Huxley has a really big issue with trying to understand what is happiness and what is truth, and how do the two conflict. Brave New World is full of characters who do everything they can to avoid facing truth, a truth specifically about their own situations. The almost universal use of drug of soma is probably the most pervasive example of this sort of self-delusion. Soma clouds the realities of the present and replaces them with a sense of hallucination. It's a tool that promotes social stability rather than any sort of conflictive change. Now, according to Mustafa Mond, the world state prioritizes happiness at the expense of truth by design, and he believes that people are better off with happiness than with truth. Um, he would, as Jack Nicholson would say from A Few Good Men, suggest that we can't handle the truth. Mond's argument that happiness refers to the immediate gratification of every citizen's desire for food, sex, drugs, nice clothes, and consumer items. That's his suggestion is what people need, that sense of immediate gratification. And it's less clear what Mond means by truth. We don't really understand what he means specifically. Or specifically even what truths he sees the world state as covering up. The government attempts to destroy all kinds of human truths, such as love, friendship, and of course, personal connection. So, Huxley is also really challenging us to think about the dangers of an all powerful state. Like Orwell's 1984, this novel depicts a dystopia in which the all powerful state controls behaviors and actions of its people in order to preserve the stability and power of the state. The major difference between the two is whereas 1984 controls maintained by constant surveillance and torture and police and things like that, in Brave New World it's maintained through technological intervention. In Brave New World, also the consequences of state control are at a loss of dignity, morals, values, and emotions, basically a loss of what we would consider humanity. There's this real focus on the idea of Ford, my Ford, the year of the Ford, right? This sort of industrialization motif. And at the level of casual conversation and habit, religion is simply replaced by reverence for technology, specifically the efficient and mechanized factory production idea of Henry Ford. Alienation is a huge motif throughout Brave New World. It provides a sort of counterpoint to the motif of total conformity that pervades the world state. Bernard Marx, Helmholtz Watson, and John are alienated from the world state, each for their own reasons. Sex is, of course, a really big deal throughout this entire book. And I want to draw attention to the book, How to Read Literature Like a Professor, like Thomas Foster. He has two really strong chapters in that. And he says, in books, everything is about sex. And the second chapter to that coincides with that is except sex. And that's a really notable thing for us to consider because there is a lot of sort of sexual illusion throughout Brave New World, and yet not a lot of it is really referring to anything sexual. Foster writes in his book, he says, when they're writing about other things, they really mean sex. And when they write about sex, they really mean something else. If they write about sex and mean strictly sex, we have a word for that. It's called pornography. In the Victorian age, sex was nearly impossible to find in polite literature due to rigid censorship, both official and self imposed. Not surprisingly, there was plenty of impolite literature. The era was unsurpassed in its production of pornography. Maybe it was the mountain of dirty writing that used up all the possibilities of writing about sex. Okay, so as Foster is suggesting, the idea here is when we take on these specific scenes within the Brave New World, you need to be asking what's going on deeper here. And we need to remember that the act of sex is sort of controlled by a system of social rewards for promiscuity and a lack of commitment. John, specifically, an outsider, is tortured by his desire for Lenina and her inability to return his love as such. The conflict between his desire for love and Lenina's desire for sex illustrates the profound difference in values between the world state and the humanity that's represented in what John will be with Shakespeare's works. We'll talk more about that later. You're not quite there as far as the reading is concerned, but we will talk more on much more in depth about Shakespeare later on. Now, Shakespeare provides the language through which John understands the world. Through John's use of Shakespeare, the novel makes contact with the rich themes that are explored in plays like The Tempest. It also creates a stark contrast between the utilitarian simplicity and sort of the inane babble of the world state propaganda and the nuanced, sort of elegant verse of a time that happened before Ford. Shakespeare's plays provide so many examples of precisely the kind of human relations, the passionate, intense, and often tragic, that the world state is trying to eliminate. So let's talk about a few symbols, allegories, and imageries, and these are not exhaustive. After all, part two will deal with a lot more of these, but I want to begin by having you think of a few of these. Animal imagery is rampant in A Brave New World. I mean, you just have to look at the first chapter. There's this repetition of straight from the horse's mouth, and Foster's implicit claim that any cow could merely hatch out embryos. And there's a platitude that he says, "Were rams wrapped up in thermogene beget no lambs." And later, when John goes to the hospital, he sees Delta children staring at Linda with sort of the stupid curiosity of animals. Hordes of identical Bokanovskified twins look like maggots. So it looks like Huxley's message is clear. The New World has so dehumanized its citizens that they now resemble little more than animals. The irony is that civilization should seek to elevate man, to make him less primitive, and to put some distance between him and sort of the other creatures in the world. That's one of the most interesting ironies, I think, within the novel itself. These animalistic traits really come into play when it comes to sex, probably because that's one of the basest, most sort of universal primordial instincts. John even quotes the goats and the monkeys line from Othello, delivered when the hero imagines his wife copulating with another man and the way the animals do. Also, Mustafa's response to John's comment, nice, tame animals, anyhow. It's really brilliant on the part of Luxley, not on the part of Mustafa. While John is disgusted by the bestial nature of sort of the New World's promiscuity, he misses the purpose behind it. Animals are tame. Animals can be controlled. In this way, the people of the world state are basically pets. They're not free people. It really gets interesting later on in chapter 18 when the crowds come swarming to see John standing around whipping himself for having dirty thoughts. And you're not there yet in your reading, but you will, and this isn't going to ruin any sort of the reading. But the descending helicopters are described as locusts and grasshoppers, and it soon becomes clear that while John condemns the civilized folk for being animals, they view him in much the same way. They throw food at him as if he's sort of this animal in a zoo. This explains why they take pleasure in his suffering, because they can't see him as a person. To them, he's just sort of an animalistic entertainment. And this raises an interesting question for us as readers. Of the savages and citizens, who is more human? Who's more animalistic? The notion of suffering seems to have a lot to do with this. John tries to prove his humanity by inflicting pain on himself. Clearly, no animal would revere the soul over the body enough to do so. It seems likely then that John needs to find a definitive way to also establish his identity as a human being and not as a creature. And then last, I want to talk, for this video at least, for part one, I want to talk about Soma. And we've begun a discussion about Soma, but just kind of a reiteration of this. It's called euphoric, narcotic, pleasantly hallucinant, and that's what Mustafa says of Soma. It's arguably the best tool the government has for controlling its population. It sedates, calms, and importantly distracts a person from realizing there's actually something very, very wrong with the world. The citizens of the world state are enslaved. Even the name soma is sleep in Latin. John, of course, will pick up on this in chapter 15, and that's why he chucks the stuff out the window in the name of freedom. It's a sort of Mel Gibson in the Patriot moment, but it's not so effective, and mostly because of the way that Soma enslaves its users through happiness. Everyone is tracked by happiness, and those are some of the toughest change to break. Another thing to think about here is that Mustafa's famous claim that Soma is Christianity without the tears. You get this sort of without the tears bit, since a consequence-free high seems to speak for itself. But what does this drug have to do with religion? Well, as we suggested, Soma is an opiate that allows its users to be controlled. Brave New World seems to argue that Christianity functions, or at least the way some people worship in Christianity, functions in much the same way. It controls through pacification. It offers comfort, but at the expense of individuality. Now, what we think of that may be different as we come in through different perspectives. That's the beginning of the literary elements that we really want to discuss and sort of a historical background of that. I hope this video helped you kind of think through some of these ideas just a little bit as you continue to read. Hopefully you'll be able to spot some more of these a little bit better.